to this Global Solution Network's Climate Hub. My name is Tom Bauman. I'm a fellow at the GSN and the Climate Hub leader. We have approximately 100 to 120 people that have registered, and I know people are still joining, so to avoid background noise, we've muted all of the participants. Also, we want you to be aware that we are recording this webinar and we'll post it soon after the webinar is completed. During the presentations, please use the chat tool to send us your questions. All the questions will be saved until the end of the presentations for the Q&A discussion. So this webinar follows on a 4-part blog series over the last few months on the theme of deep decarbonization needs deep collaboration. The Paris Agreement sends a clear signal and a target to remain within the 2-degree and preferably 1.5-degree change in temperature by 2050. To achieve this target requires deep decarbonization, meaning reducing greenhouse gas emissions while growing a green economy. But of course, the Paris Agreement is much more than deep decarbonization, including adaptation, capacity building, and transparency. The Paris Agreement also highlights the importance of leveraging digital technologies for climate solutions and climate actions, which is the focus of this webinar. The speakers, which I'll introduce shortly, have been organized to present you with an overall storyline of the evolving state-of-the-art of online networks related to climate change. I will start with an overview of the Global Solution Networks, highlighting some of the key points of research and tools that have been developed over the last few years. And this will provide you some background context about transitioning to the next generation online networks and the network of networks. So I will give you just a few slides, and then after my presentation we'll have Florian Bauer of the Climate Knowledge Brokers who will present about the Climate Knowledge Brokers, their manifesto that describes the strategy for more effective climate knowledge brokers to improve the utility of climate-related information to achieve stakeholder goals such as climate resilience. Climate knowledge brokers need to use collaboration tools, facilitate communities of practice, and deploy appropriate collaboration strategies to address issues of stakeholder awareness and trust, the quality and content of climate information, and support the process of leveraging climate knowledge into climate actions. Then we'll have a presentation by Ira Feldman. Ira founded the Climate Adaptation Scholars online network in 2012, and it now includes nearly 2,600 experts in over 160 countries. The Climate Adaptation Scholars Group was started as a LinkedIn group with approximately 80 substantive discussion threads. Now it's transitioning to a new online platform to support more interactive collaboration amongst the expert network in order to develop not only the Knowledge Hub, but to link that hub with other networks, including Adaptation Standards 2.0. And then our final presenter is Joe Madden. Joe leads development of the Commodity Impact Factor system and coordinates a diverse group of experts in that regard that specialize in GSNs, blockchain technology, which some might know in the form of Bitcoin, the Internet of Things, exchanges, standards, supply chain, and of course sustainability. The Commodity Impact Factor system links up different types of GSNs, for example, knowledge hubs, governance, operational and delivery platforms, and of course standards. and links that with the complementary digital technologies to enable scalable solutions and facilitate the market transformations towards sustainability. So in summary, this webinar presents an overview of the transition from initial online networks that have helped with information sharing and networking, but were relatively simple, and moving towards more robust platforms supported by proficient climate knowledge brokers and integrating more of the digital technologies to enable new business models. And really all of this constitutes deep collaboration, which is essential for helping reach the Paris Agreement goals. So I'll jump into a quick overview of the Global Solutions Networks. So our mission is to fill the knowledge gap surrounding multi-stakeholder networks, the different types, that are used for global problem solving, to put GSN tools in the hands of people working to solve global problems, and to help connect the people and networks in addressing common global issues. So GSN 1.0, or where it started, was really filling the knowledge gap about the different types of global solution networks. And so what is a GSN? It addresses a global problem, engages a diverse stakeholder community, utilizes the digital technologies that are available, and they're self-organizing, self-governing networks. There are numerous types of GSNs, and so the research which is available on the GSN website, which is gsnetworks.org, describes these different types of GSNs in much more detail and provides a lot of complementary research in the form of interviews with leading experts in the digital technology space as they relate to a variety of global issues. So the tools for implementing a GSN are part of the GSN platform that's available, and we present it as webs in terms of welcoming people to the GSN platform in terms of basic concepts and definitions, helping them then to explore the research and providing them tools and guidance, like a field guide to help them build next generation online networks and to connect with other networks and help these GSNs scale. So the Global Solutions Network has several hubs, and so here's the different hubs that are available. We have an Employment and Jobs Hub, the Climate and Planet Stewardship Hub, Humanity, Cities, and Accessibility, and other hubs are all in the plans. One of the very valuable features of the GSN platform are these network cards that help to convey a large amount of information in a very organized format. So for example, in the case of the Climate and Planet Stewardship Network, here's a few examples where we have a brief description of the network, what kind of GSN is it. In some cases, GSNs are more than just one type, it's a combination. And then what are their focus areas that we have tagged them with, whether that's mitigation, adaptation, resilience, sustainability, etc. And then we provide the means with which to connect with them via email, their website, social networks, and then to create your own list of GSNs towards your goals of creating a network of networks. Very briefly, the GSN has been generously sponsored by these organizations that have helped GSN over the last few years. And just in summary, the challenge for GSNs and the solution that the GSN platform provides is using new tools to help people connect and make this network of networks and engage and transition towards the next generation of online networks. So before handing it over to our next speaker, I just want to highlight this. This is the first webinar for the Climate Hub. And next week we have another webinar on ACFO Flow, Can GSNs Accelerate Innovation Through Partnerships? And you can learn more about that by an email. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over controls to Florian Bauer, and he can take it from there.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. I'll just take over the screen, which should work now. Good, yeah, well, hello everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. My name is Florian Bauer. I'm working for an organization called REAP, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership. And in that organization, I'm responsible for a part of the organization which is called Open Knowledge. And as part of this program that we are running here, we are leading the coordination hub of a group called the Climate Knowledge Brokers Group. And this is what I want to talk about today a little bit, which in essence is about that climate smart decisions require effective knowledge brokers and connected knowledge systems. So let me start with, can you see my screen still? Tom, can you just tell me if you see the screen, because it says it's paused?
It's looking good to me.
Good, perfect. I wanted to start with addressing the challenge ahead. I mean, when we, Tom already mentioned the Paris agreements and so on, but when we talk about our future, we talk about a climate resilient future, hopefully, and climate smart development. But what this means is that many more people will need to make decisions based on climate information. And that poses a few questions, like where do users get the knowledge from? Who are actually those users of climate information? What kind of information do those users need? How do we need to present that information to them so that it is useful to them? And also, and that's the main topic of today, how can we work together to be more effective in providing the information and knowledge to those users? And finally, what is needed to improve the quality and use of climate knowledge in decision making, because that is the main thing we need to achieve, is that decisions are made on the best available climate knowledge. So because this is a big topic, what was created a few years ago is a community of practice, basically, which is called the Climate Knowledge Brokers Group. This is a network of more than 150 organizations and professionals who are really focused on providing that high quality information and knowledge to different stakeholders, which vary very much. And what I would like to address here is that we have a big challenge here. I'm just using here a slide which is showing some logos. We call it the logo soup slide. This is just a few of the knowledge brokers and the portals that they're providing, which are part of the Climate Knowledge Brokers Group. By far not all. But what you see already here, and you all will be aware of that, there's so much around there, and we have a big challenge of connecting that, bringing that together, and so on. So what are the biggest challenges for knowledge brokers? By the way, knowledge brokers, when we talk about them, we think about knowledge brokers in terms of people or organizations who broker knowledge from one person or an organization to another one. So basically, who are the translators, the intermediaries of this information provision, who tailor knowledge to specific user needs. But what are the main challenges for those organizations and people? Well, we think that this can be defined in four main challenges. The first one is understanding the user needs. Sounds very simple, is not. When we talk to knowledge brokers, very often this is a big challenge for them to really understand what are the user needs of my target group. Second one is because there are so many platforms already out there, there is a challenge on signposting to the right platform rather than replicating what is already out there. Then the third one is about connecting websites, climate websites. Because we know many high-quality websites are already out there and we want to avoid replicating the content, what is needed for the users is that we connect this content effectively so that users can find the information easily. And then last but not least, what is required is that we as knowledge brokers also learn from each other to become more effective in what we're doing. I want to go in this presentation a little bit deeper in understanding the user needs, because we think this is the most essential part of the story of being an effective knowledge broker. What we have done in the past year is we wrote a book, we wrote a publication which is called the Climate Knowledge Brokers Manifesto. This is a publication that was done jointly by a lot of people involved in the Climate Knowledge Brokers group, and what we wanted to do there, the aim was to identify what makes knowledge brokers effective, what is needed, and to explain why effective knowledge brokering is so important these times. So basically what we've done is that we interviewed quite a lot of people from various different sectors in various different regions in the world and asked them about their needs, about what they think is important in terms of presenting climate information, in terms of providing climate information. And we put that all together and we started to describe the essential role of climate knowledge brokers in achieving a vision which we define as a world in which people make climate sensitive decisions fully informed by the best available climate knowledge. And I want to take out one example out of the manifesto and go a little bit deeper into that. And because I said user needs are so important, let's stick with the user needs. But while developing the manifesto, we very quickly found out that obviously, understanding the user needs is absolutely essential for effective knowledge brokers. So we tried to create a kind of a set of different user needs, and we avoided to go into the usual route of saying, well, there is a stakeholder, there is a project implementer, there is a funder, a policymaker. But we tried to categorize the user needs differently in terms of what is the issue for them. And we came up with 5, which you see on this slide, starting from people who are just not aware of the issue. I mean, this is something that is reality. Some people are just not aware that they would need climate information for their decision making. Second user group is those who have a lack of quality information. Very often in developing countries, but also in developed countries, there are some parts where there is just a lack of high quality information. Third one is about information that's there but is hidden. It could be behind a paywall, it could be behind just not very well accessible, or it could be, not digitalized and so on. So this is also a big challenge for users very often. And then we come to 2 which are also quite big challenges. One is the untailored information. What you all will recognize when you look for climate information, you'll find tons and tons of information, but very often, and that's the last one already, which is too much information, but very often this information is not tailored to user needs. So each user group has a specific user need, specific need and needs tailored information, and that's very often not happening. And that's where effective knowledge brokers come in and try to solve that and try to create information that is accessible and useful to users. A second part that I want to point out quickly is about the importance of connecting climate websites, and that's because specifically this webinar addresses that. The challenge here, again, we have had that quite a lot of information. Here you see just the amount of increase of climate information on the web, which often is visualized by users as the ocean of climate information. You feel like there is so much out there and you need to navigate that. Challenge, very often this is provided in information silos. So there is just one website in a silo, not connected to others. Usual project, the project finalizes after 5 years and then information gets outdated. And so the essential challenge for users is it's very often difficult to find the right information. And in the Climate Knowledge Brokers group, we try to address that with a tool, which I will only mention very briefly, but I hope you have a look on that, which is called the Climate Tagger. The Climate Tagger is a tool which can be used on climate portals, on websites. So it's not an end-user tool, it's a tool for climate portal providers. It can be installed on these climate knowledge platforms, like a content management system. And what it basically does, it can scan unstructured information like PDFs, like content on the website, and automatically, based on an expert's vetted thesaurus, can apply tags to those documents. So it basically can structure content, and that's the interesting thing about it, it can also put it in connection to other content on other websites. We call that the content pool, which you see on the bottom of that slide. There are also some other features like geotagging, enriching it with geographic information or with definitions and so on, but I'll leave that for this webinar. This is a story for a whole different webinar. The essence of that tool is it's important to be consistent in terms of how you describe the content on your website. And if you do that, it's easy to connect between different websites and to provide users linkages to find relevant other content on other websites. I've just added a slide on additional information. Please have a look at the Manifesto website. You can download the free PDF. There are some interviews, some success stories, and so on. And of course, if you want to try the Climate Tagger, have a look on the website or come back to us, and we are very happy to help with that. Thank you very much. That's it from my side, and I'll hand back to Tom in terms of starting the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Florian. A very interesting presentation, and I know it's difficult to cover that much detail in the short amount of time that we have, so thank you for providing the follow-up links for the audience. So I'm going to transfer presenter rights to our next speaker, who is Ira Feldman of the Climate Adaptation Scholars Group. And I hope everyone can see his presentation. Ira?
Thank you, Tom. Just by way of brief background, I'm an environmental lawyer by training, and at this stage of my career, most consider me to be a sustainability professional. I've developed a specialized expertise in climate adaptation and ecosystem services. I've also pioneered the development of alternate environmental regulatory pathways and corporate voluntary environmental excellence programs, utilizing in part voluntary standards such as ISO standards for environmental management systems and corporate social responsibility. I've worn lots of hats within the climate adaptation space. I'm not going to discuss each of these on this slide, except to note that I developed a graduate course on climate adaptation at the University of Pennsylvania, which in turn spawned the Climate Adaptation Scholars Group. It's the combination or confluence of my adaptation experience and my voluntary standards experience that's at the core of my remarks today on the following key points. Background on the Climate Adaptation Scholars Group, next generation online solutions, generally speaking, and then specifically how we are developing an online standard system for adaptation. I also don't want to assume that everyone on the line has a broad familiarity with the climate adaptation space. Indeed, particularly in the US, focus on greenhouse gas mitigation or carbon management had relegated adaptation to the sidelines for quite some time. In brief, mitigation and adaptation are the two sides of the coin of the global climate dialogue. They're inextricably linked. If we fail to aggressively pursue mitigation, then we will have magnitudes greater need for adaptation to the impacts of climate change. I think in talking about knowledge networks today, it's important to understand that despite the calls for integrating mitigation and adaptation at the policy and implementation level, mitigation and adaptation are still today largely two separate communities of practice. So with that backdrop, Climate Adaptation Scholars as a group was started as an activity for my 16 graduate students in the spring of 2012. As Tom mentioned in the introduction, we're approaching 2,600 members today. I established this group as a LinkedIn group, and in fact, we're still accepting members through LinkedIn. But over the last couple of months, we've been transitioning Climate Adaptation Scholars Group to a more robust and multifunctional platform on Collaborate. So over the 4 years on LinkedIn, we amassed content in well over 80 dedicated threads organized by adaptation topic, geography, and/or sector. I set it up this way because most of the LinkedIn groups focusing on adaptation, resilience, or preparedness were very ad hoc, like LinkedIn groups on any topic. It was very difficult to trace back the flow of comments, and virtually impossible to group topics together. So in order to overcome that on the LinkedIn platform, it really required an extraordinary effort because LinkedIn did not anticipate or encourage that type of structure. The reaction over the last several years was uniformly positive from the full range of the adaptation community of practice. Despite the scholar's name, the membership cuts across practitioners, policymakers, and academics. All of them valued the organization of the posts and the requirement that each post have a link to the original source. I have received scores of emails thanking me for having the best organized adaptation group. My favorite comment was that taken together, the group is a veritable online think tank, and that's been very satisfying. But the question I always had is, to what end are we pulling together all this information? And in the early going, I was happy to understand and appreciate that for those members of the group who scrolled their way through all the threads and tried to understand the structure, they came away with a better understanding or a mental map of the full interdisciplinary adaptation space. But that in and of itself was not sufficient to justify the level of effort, and it became increasingly clear that we wanted to leverage the content and the expertise in the membership to create deliverables, knowledge products such as guides and standards and other derivative works that would advance the adaptation state of play. So as of last May at the U.S. National Adaptation Summit in St. Louis, I announced that Climate Adaptation Scholars would no longer be just a LinkedIn group, but we would also seek to convene dialogues on specific topics and generate deliverables, including a contract that we signed to develop an online textbook. Concurrently, LinkedIn actually further constrained the functionality of their platform, so I accelerated my effort to find a different platform to leverage the collected content and the expertise and the growing membership of the group. So the overall goal was to cultivate the existing content as more of an interactive knowledge wiki, to augment the content to become inputs to standard development, similar to what we are describing now as Standards 2.0. We want to engage multiple stakeholder groups to define and populate the framework and the roadmap. We're not doing this for our own proprietary reasons. We want to, as I said earlier, advance the state of play, so the point would be to link these networks with other existing processes, such as the ongoing process within ISO to develop climate adaptation standards, the UNFCCC Secretariat, the UNFCCC Adaptation Committee, to better inform those processes with multi-stakeholder engagement and input. Ultimately, however, we certainly thought that our group could evolve into a self-governing adaptation platform for standards and best practices. So as we move toward achieving those goals, we expect to catalyze and motivate the adaptation community to greater scale and efficiency. We want to advance the understanding of adaptation issues, especially, and this is important to me, for people to understand the interdisciplinary aspects of the community of practice and how adaptation is closely linked to sustainability concepts and principles, which certainly distinguishes adaptation, in my view, from the more quantitative orientation of mitigation. And finally, leverage adaptation standards that are developed, whether by us in the group or through ISO processes, as mobilizing, creating tools that mobilize climate action in support of the Paris Agreement on the one hand, and for those who are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals that were released last year, we wanted to be in a position to inform implementation of the SDGs as well. So just to briefly mention, expand on my brief mention of ISO. ISO, of course, is the major player in standards development, but adaptation is a relatively new area for ISO. Within ISO Technical Committee 207, it's Subcommittee 7, we have an ongoing process that, in fact, has already been informed by this online community of practice. Over the past year, we pulled together through our online outreach an outline of the current adaptation landscape, plus the identification of perceived needs and priority activities, identifying what guidance or standards the adaptation community of practice thought might be needed. That ISO adaptation standards development process is continuing, will continue to play out over a 3 to 4 year time frame, which is typical for a traditional ISO process. But it's clear that ISO needed to engage with the adaptation community to be sure that the ISO products were informed by the current state of play and best practices. There is a concern, however, and even though I am coordinating the ISO adaptation standards development process within ISO, that our roadmap for ISO adaptation standards will not in and of itself fully meet the needs of the adaptation community, because the state of the art in adaptation is wide-ranging, rapidly evolving, and arguably needs a process that is a little bit more nimble or agile and dynamic. And what based on my experience with climate adaptation scholars, what's needed is an online network that can achieve the objectives of fair participation, transparency, cost effectiveness, and speed to market. The question is, how can we make this happen? Not to replace ISO, but as a complement to ISO and to pilot this Adaptation 2.0 idea. So this cuts across three different aspects: how we develop, how the process for developing the standard, as I said, more agile and participatory, more transparent and democratized. So there's the process, there's the structure. The structure can be more modular and comparable, and the resulting guidance can be living documents rather than static documents for continuous updates. And finally, this approach is informed by global solution networks, that it's standards development plus the application of the standards plus the knowledge exchange that results from that entire process. So very briefly to wrap up, this is the vision. We've already actually completed these first three steps. We've engaged the adaptation community of practice through climate adaptation scholars. We've developed a robust interactive platform of experts, knowledge, and structured collaboration. We're still piloting various aspects of that. And we are already supporting experts through climate adaptation scholars in an open standard system to develop standards and related guidance. And just to recount that, so we've transitioned from LinkedIn to the more robust Collaborate platform, and we believe that we will have the result of timely standards that better reflect the actual state of play. I referenced the Paris Agreement. How we're going to pilot this with an initial specific topic to develop guidance is drawn directly from Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, which calls for parties to the Paris Agreement to develop adaptation communications. I won't belabor the details here from these three provisions, but since we know that the adaptation communication topic is not within the ISO adaptation agenda, and it's not in the UNFCCC Adaptation Committee agenda, we felt safe in picking this topic to engage the broader adaptation community online through climate adaptation scholars on Collaborate to begin to develop and co-create guidance on adaptation communication. There's no consensus framework for such disclosure of information at this point. We intend to move the needle on that state of play. And finally, this is all happening on climate adaptation scholars on the Collaborate platform, and what you see up there now is the link to the public page for climate adaptation scholars on Collaborate and more detailed information for anyone. And this is open to anyone who opts into the climate adaptation scholars group. We will then proceed to develop the guidance with the full participation of the climate adaptation community of practice. Here's my contact information if anyone would like to follow up directly with me for further information. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira, for the very interesting discussion around the evolution of a knowledge hub and its movement into more of a GSN 2.0. But without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our final speaker, Joe Madden. I'm just going to transfer over presenter rights to you, Joe.
Okay. Can see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. My name is Joe Madden. I'm a co-founder and CEO at EOS Climate. And in this case, we're talking about, my background is in environmental market development and supply chain, but in this case, we're talking about a concept that we've developed over the last year or so with a broad set of stakeholders that really is designed to use existing markets to price externalities within the global market infrastructure. So we'll see if we can cover that and how we get there in about 7 minutes. So it's a quick pace here. So let's see here.
Joe, you can take a little bit more time if you'd like, like another 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay. So along with the agreement at COP and a number of the other regional movements around with regards to environmental initiatives, whether pricing carbon via tax or using market mechanisms, there's effectively a new entrant in driving climate action and specifically decarbonization, and that's the capital markets themselves. And in this case, it's really relates to risk as a fundamental driver in capital markets. So there's a lot of activity and divestment and so forth, which is in many ways, it's quite promotional or activist. But the fact is that there's capital now moving away in the financial markets. Capital is moving away from carbon-intensive holdings. So there's new products being developed. And you can also see the pressure for corporates to disclose information in relation to carbon intensity and performance is reflected in the increase in CDP reporting and in a number of different frameworks as well. So it's a new driver of climate action, and that introduces some interesting things. So usually in the world that I live in, most people talk about markets. They're talking largely about greenhouse gas markets and environmental commodity markets in relation to renewable energy credits and things like that. But in this case, when we talk about capital markets more broadly, they look different than compliance markets. They're global. They're not necessarily subject to political constructs, particularly in a national or subnational context. They tend to price things based on the future as opposed to the past, and they really make relative comparisons. And further, they're incredibly dynamic, and not to say that environmental compliance markets are not dynamic in any at all, but I would say it's a case of the capital markets being incredibly dynamic, taking into account a number of different factors. And in order for capital markets to incorporate environmental and sustainability information, climate information, legal and standards definitions have to be incredibly robust. And so if we step back just a little bit here, the commodity markets in particular present a very unique opportunity. Most commodities that trade today are effectively fungible, whether it's cotton or steel or oil. They trade, a base unit is fungible within the market, but if we take a look at the impacts associated with the underlying commodity, there's a wide variance in impact. And so this graph here represents about 30 or so different sources of oil and the aggregate carbon impact of both the material within the barrel of oil, the actual crude oil itself, and the emissions association with its extraction and transport, and refining. So there's a very big difference here, an 80% variance in greenhouse gas impact between the lowest and highest carbon intensity oil. However, today the markets do not account for this. So oil trades effectively on par as a barrel of oil, give or take with some minor adjustments with regards to content within the oil. So if we are going to leverage and reach a world where existing market infrastructure is effectively driving decarbonization, the critical piece is integrity and scale. And so integrity in this case, we're talking about virtual assets. So the integrity of the information has to be paramount such that it can be incorporated into global markets. And in order for this to reach scale, it has to span national boundaries, subnational boundaries, and be accepted by numerous different stakeholder communities. So technologies that have come into being in the last decade really enable this to happen. So through leveraging several different types of technologies and applications of technologies, you can put together a system that is capable of delivering this type of information with the necessary integrity to the market. And that includes mobile technology, blockchain technology, big data analytics from a verification perspective, and global solution networks, which enable this scalability and the dynamic sort of improvement of standards over time. So if we look at this in a step-by-step process, global solution networks are sort of a foundational element here. And I think Tom mentioned this, but both in operationalizing and creating the knowledge necessary to generate the standards, facilitating the standards development process itself. And then once those standards are developed, they can be applied by pre-qualifying producers, and then the information, big data analytics can be applied, secondary data sets can be applied to verify the information at scale, and the metrics that are then generated can be placed onto the blockchain and effectively create a global registry that can deliver the information to the markets themselves. And once that happens, market forces can work. And so if we look at this in a very simple context, today, two different types of oil on the global market trade effectively on par. They're looked at as equal, as I mentioned, give or take some physical attributes. At point of delivery, they may test and differentiate very, very slightly upon delivery. But if the information associated with impact is also delivered, the barrels begin to look different. And in a carbon-constrained world, carbon-intensive oil is less attractive than low-impact oil. And so we're using oil. We could be talking about palm oil or soybeans or steel or any other effective raw material that trades in global markets. It's just very simple in concept of delivering the data and metrics associated with the underlying asset so that intangible attributes can be understood by the market. So in order to do that, a number of different questions arise with regards to standards and legal definitions, how the market itself can be assured of the validity and integrity of the products, and how do these attributes, how are they included in international treaties and international trade and so forth. which are no small questions. And so when we look at what facilitates this, ultimately it is global solution networks that provide the ability for mobilizing large-scale stakeholders or stakeholders on a large enough scale to deliver this type of system. And so if there's questions, we've put together a group of folks from exchanges, standards, environmental markets, and also producers, and most of the information about SIF System is at sifsystem.com. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much, Joe. I've been, and thanks to all of the speakers for their presentations. The presentations will be made available afterwards, including a link to the recorded webinar. I've been monitoring the chat window and welcome any questions from the audience to come in anytime now. But in the meantime, I am going to ask a question to each of the speakers, starting with Florian. Florian, could you tell us what are the main challenges for knowledge brokers in being effective according to your experience in the climate knowledge brokers?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think, as said, one of the main challenges is understanding the user needs. That's the first, and I think that's quite essential. Another one is that because there are so many other portals and organizations already around there providing information, there is a big challenge in just knowing about them and having an opportunity to talk to them about cooperation possibilities. And then the third challenge, I would say, is around being effective in reusing what is already out there, which is quite an important topic, but often more difficult to achieve than you would think, because there are organizational barriers to that, there's sometimes financial barriers to that, and also technical barriers in terms of how do I connect to another website, how do I reuse data sets, are data sets made available as open data, for example, which would facilitate that process, and so on. So I think that would be the three main challenges.
Thank you very much. That's very informative. I fully agree that understanding the needs of the stakeholders is fundamental. Quickly moving over to ask a question of Ira Feldman and the Climate Adaptation Scholars LinkedIn group. Are all of the threads that you mentioned still available on LinkedIn? And sort of a second part, you had mentioned that these are being transitioned to Collaborate. When will all of those threads be available there as well?
Thanks for that question, Tom. Yes, all the threads, the well over 80 topical threads on LinkedIn, they're all still there. I've been urging people who are members of the LinkedIn group to make the simple transition by pushing one button to join us on Collaborate. I personally am only posting on Collaborate. I've selected about 40 topics to transition over in this first wave, and so those conversations have been continuing on Collaborate. What we are little by little doing is taking the archived materials from the LinkedIn side and posting them on the Collaborate side for the convenience of the members, so they don't need to be switching back and forth, and that process, I hope, will be completed in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much, Ira. And now over to Joe. Can you elaborate on how you're differentiating existing markets from environmental markets to get a better understanding of that?
So just at a base level, environmental markets are largely created through some sort of regulatory action or some sort of compliance or policy movement. What we're talking about here in the differentiation of these markets would be that we're talking about the actual existing markets today. So existing commodity exchanges that currently trade all of these, various agricultural, extractive, and industrial products. And so we're talking in this case about those markets that exist and delivering information to those markets to allow them to price in intangible attributes like greenhouse gas intensity or water use or land or even potentially social aspects. So the existing compliance markets, so for example, in California there's a cap and trade system. It's defined by the state. It operates, it's linked in some cases, it's linked with Quebec, but it's defined by those two regulatory entities. In this case, what we're talking about is the global markets that exist for commodities today. And simply, when I say simply, it's not so simple, but simply adding information to the underlying materials that are traded in those markets such that the market has the ability to differentiate itself.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate the challenge involved in creating this new transformative platform, and looking forward to some amazing progress this year for CIF. Well, we're at the top of the hour of this 60-minute webinar, and if there are no other questions, and I can't see any in the chat, then I'd like to thank our audience for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed it. As I said, the information will be provided shortly to everyone that registered, and again, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for fantastic presentations, and I hope to talk with all of you afterwards.
Thanks, Tom.